Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to be talking about a discovery right here in our own solar system. Actually, two discoveries. Now, I actually left for a couple of weeks, I had to do a few things, and as soon as I left, we started discovering incredible things in our own solar system, in other star systems, and there's going to be a lot of videos in the next few weeks to basically catch up with all of these events. But this one here kind of takes the cake because it's basically something that was always there, but we never really noticed it. And as you can see from the picture right here, what we discovered is basically rings. Really beautiful, really awesome looking rings that are in the orbit of Venus and also in the orbit of Mercury. Now these are actually two completely separate studies, but it just so happens that they happened around the same time. And interestingly, what these rings suggest to us is that there's a lot of asteroids in the orbit of Venus and Mercury that we've never really discovered, or actually never even looked for. So let's talk a little bit more about this, and let's discuss what was really discovered. So, first of all, this is the first paper that talks about the circumsolar dust ring near Mercury's orbit by Guillermo Stenborg, and the second paper is by Petrov and Mark Kuchner, and this is the one about Venus, or specifically the ring around Venus. Now both of these papers are in the description below, so you can read more about the study itself, but let me actually explain to you how this was basically discovered, how we were able to identify these particular rings. And to discover one of these rings, the scientists used this satellite right here known as Stereo Ahead. There's actually two parallel satellites, one is called Ahead and one is called Behind, and if you were to look at where they're located in the same orbit as our planet Earth, and this is actually the orbit here, except that one of them orbits a little bit ahead of Earth and one of them orbits behind Earth. And they're used for various studies, but in this particular case, both of these satellites, or specifically this one actually, were just looking at the sun. And while looking at the sun, they were able to detect something really unusual, specifically dust. They were actually able to see an increase of about 5% of brightness due to dust, or basically reflections from the dust, no matter where the spacecraft was in its orbit. And interestingly, this only has one explanation, that there's dust pretty much all across the orbit of Venus and also all across the orbit of Mercury. Now, the dust right here, this is the Venus dust, is actually a little bit more well studied. We even know that the thickness here is approximately 15 million kilometers. But the dust ring of Mercury, even though it's kind of smaller, is a little bit more interesting and a little bit more exciting because we never expected to find anything so close to the Sun. Mostly because we thought that because Mercury is so close to the Sun, the solar emissions, and specifically the solar wind, would actually most likely dislodge anything that would be that close to it. And the only way for this ring to actually maintain itself is to have a source of dust. And this is where it gets a little bit interesting. If we were to try to create this ring in Universe Sandbox just to simulate what all of this looks like, if Mercury is right here, then somewhere in its orbit there are at least several hundred relatively large asteroids, and these asteroids are most likely responsible for creating all of this dust. Now, we're not entirely sure how big these asteroids are, but just based on the amount of dust we've detected, it may suggest that if we were to combine all of this dust into one single piece, it would create a rock approximately 3, maybe 4 kilometers in diameter. And all of these rocks are obviously responsible for shedding all of this dust and then depositing it in orbit. And as the sun expels some of these dust particles through various activities such as, for example, solar flares or just solar wind in general, each of these asteroids is then responsible for slowly shedding this dust and creating the ring that we've detected. Now, we don't really know the mechanism exactly just yet. We don't even know what's causing these particles to kind of appear as a dust ring. We just know that it's there. And even though we suspected the one around Venus to be relatively large and we kind of knew that it was there, we really didn't expect Mercury to have anything similar. So now we know that pretty much every major object in the solar system has these unusual rings. We're pretty sure that Earth has it as well. We just haven't really been able to detect it just yet because it is relatively difficult to see it. And so basically the discovery kind of looks like this. There is the ring around Mercury that's a little bit smaller, and the ring around Venus, Venus is somewhere right there, that's a little bit larger. And this also implies that it's very likely that Venus has slightly more asteroids, or potentially that Sun doesn't really have as much influence over the region where Venus is located, as opposed to the region where Mercury is. Now, we don't really know much else. Like, for example, we don't really know how long this ring will exist, or if it's going to expand or shrink. And also, we don't really know its composition just yet. We just know that it's kind of thin, and for the most part, the only actual explanation so far is the simulation that was run using, well, actually something similar to Universe Sandbox. Basically, the way that the scientists were able to explain how these rings were formed is by running a simulation for about, well, kind of 4.5 billion years really, and they initially placed approximately 10,000 rocks in the same orbit as Venus. And their simulation showed that even after 4.5 billion years, at least 800 asteroids are still going to stay in the orbit here. And they're still going to orbit and release the actual dust material. And this dust material will then kind of stay around until Sun expels it somewhere to the outskirts of the outer solar system. And even though we don't really know what it's made out of, it's very likely that it's probably rocky and also metallic in its composition. So in other words, it's very likely not ices, not water, not anything that's easy to dislodge by the sun. It's probably something heavy, and for all we know, it might be even precious. But because this is so diffuse, it's actually very, very thin. It's almost like a vacuum here. These particles are really, really far away from each other. In that sense, it's not really that useful other than scientific curiosity. Like, there's no way we're going to be able to collect these particles or to in any way use them. It's just going to stay in this orbit until the sun expels it for good. And even a spacecraft that passes through this dust cloud doesn't really have to worry about any collisions or anything, because these particles are really far away, really, really small, and it would be really, really challenging for us to even find one of these particles. So in that sense, it's a really interesting discovery, but doesn't have much practical use just yet. It will, however, help us understand our own solar system and the evolution of the solar system, but also help us understand what we're looking at when we're seeing these rings in other star systems as well. And on that note, that's unfortunately all we know right now. As new studies come out, I'm going to definitely mention the follow-up in one of the future videos. But for now, well, that's really it. We discovered two really cool rings in our own solar system around Mercury and Venus. And thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about our own solar system from this video. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. Share this video with someone who enjoys learning about space through simulations and video games, and come back tomorrow to learn something else. Now that I'm back, I have a lot of things to cover in the next few weeks, so there's going to be basically a lot of new stuff coming out. Thank you so much for watching, thank you for all of your support, and especially to those of you that support me on Patreon, because it does help me quite a lot. And I'll see you tomorrow. Space out, and as always, bye bye.